Okay, so today's lesson, like I said, we are going over metabolism. So we are looking at ATP production. We're also going to look a little bit at metabolism in a way that we haven't in previous classes. We're going to mention a little bit about like how body temperature and things like that are controlled, because that is part of your metabolism as well. And so we'll be looking at a couple different things that are related to metabolic function that we haven't looked at in the past. But our main kind of purpose that we're always trying to like kind of build a solid foundation for understanding is like how our energy systems work to produce ATP, right? Like that's really the goal, is like we want to understand like, you know, how is it ATP is produced in various different ways? Are we producing lots of ATP really quickly? Are we producing very little ATP, but like all the time? You know, like which version of our energy metabolism are we using when we are kind of looking at this here. So that's kind of our main goal, because that determines like what energy system we can target based on exercise. Like if I make you exercise for long durations, well, you can't do high intensity for long duration, right? Like your 1 rep max can be done for a total of 1 reps, you know, like that's why it's your 1 rep max. So that is one specific energy system, particularly what we call your phosphagen system. And that's actually not even one that we're going to look at today. We're very much taking like the biology standpoint of metabolism. So you're going to notice that we're going to start with glycolysis. Because we're just looking at ATP production more so than we're looking at like ATP maybe reproduction. For those of you who know what I'm talking about there. Let's go ahead and just kind of do a brief overview, and then we'll dive into the video here. So metabolism, right? There's different parts of it, right? We do know that like metabolism is all chemical processes, right? It's your catabolism, it's your anabolism, right? It's building stuff up, it's breaking stuff down. And then there's also like the cellular respiration side of things. Like how are your cells generating energy? Like until now, we've been talking a lot about just like building stuff up and breaking stuff down. And that's totally part of your metabolism, but it's not the stuff, or at least we haven't looked at the stuff that actually is our molecular currency in a way. You know, like we haven't looked at like how our body's actually spending energy, because you know, we know there's energy trapped in food, right? Like if we go like just a basic breakdown, right? A basic breakdown of how the entire universe works. You have like a sun, right? And it has all this heat energy. And we know that energy can't be deleted, but it can change forms. And so that energy slams into planet Earth. And then that heat energy gets transformed by plants into things like carbohydrates and fats and proteins. And then we take those plants in and we consume them. And, you know, that's what kind of makes up like all of our cells. And so our body's converting direct energy from the sun. That's actually where all of our ATP and all of our calories and everything came from. You know, it all came from that, but it's just changed into, you know, your shape. And so that's all really good. But like the problem with like converting energy is we can't just like use it in its pure form. Like we can't just like take it in and like directly use it. So we have to have like a form that we can spend, right? It's just like I think he's going to use an analogy in the video that's great. It's like you can't go to Mexico and try to spend dollars. You have to convert your money into like pesos, right? Actually, I've never been to Mexico.
Depends what part of Mexico you're in.
It depends on what part. Yeah, okay, that makes sense. That's like in Oregon and Washington. Oregon doesn't have like sales tax, and my parents like live on the border, so they can show their Oregon ID, and then they don't have to pay sales tax in Washington. And they just sign this little piece of paper, and then basically Washington just charges Oregon for sales tax like later. Yeah, but you can't spend like I can't go to, you know, London. Man, I'm just showing off how poorly traveled I am and spend pounds. Yeah, you know, I gotta use the right type of currency, and so the type of currency that we're going to use is ATP. Let's get back to what I know. We're going to spend ATP, adenosine triphosphate. That is our energy. That's our form of energy, right? And it's a really cool little stored form, right? It's basically this little molecule of adenosine and these 3 little phosphates that are attached to it. And there's energy trapped between all those bonds. And so our body's like, great, well, I'm just going to hold that ATP molecule right there. Oh, I need energy. Boom. So it breaks one of those bonds, releases that energy, and now we can capture it and use it. that's awesome because then we don't have to like burn up. If we were just like holding on all of our energy, like, you know, if we were to, like, let's say like if you were to eat food and it were to break into ATP instantly, right? Rather than and not even, I'm sorry, not even break into ATP, break into energy instantly, right? Your body would just completely overheat. It would just, all that energy would constantly be burning, just like a freaking fire, right? And that's not what we want. We want to have like a storage form so we can draw on it whenever we need it. And that's where ATP comes in. So when we're talking about cellular respiration, that's what we're going to be looking at today. We're going to look at how to make those ATP molecules. We'll look very quickly again at some of our nutrition guidelines, carbs, proteins, fats. Today we will discuss vitamins and minerals just a little bit. Because we definitely know that some of our vitamins are essential for ATP production. They actually act as some of the enzymes that kind of kick those reactions off. And then we're not going to spend too much time talking about like metabolic disorders. I mean, weight control is something that's in these PowerPoint slides. And I'll probably, you know, take a second to stop there just because it's so relevant to our industry. But like, we understand weight control, you know, without sounding too arrogant, but much better than this, you know, medical textbook does. Like, that's not really their realm. Just like some of these other things are not our job. So then nutrition and aging, yeah, we're going to move past that pretty quick. And then I'll mention a little bit about body temperature just because that does play a role in like certain physiologic functions and stuff. So we will mention those just a little bit here at the end. So before we dive into that, let's get some freaking animations under our belt. And there he is. I'm serious, man. I've clicked the like, I don't want this ad. I'm not interested. Over and over and over again, and it has done nothing. And normally it works really well, which is what's extra frustrating. All right.
To fly a rocket ship, you need to be an optimist.
Oh, look who it is. It's
no astronaut
Scott Kelly.
Space with their fingers crossed.
Do you guys remember when we were watching the videos about remember when we were watching the videos about like the guy who spent the most time in space and his bone density decreased like crazy? This is him. This is him right here.
How we deal with risk.
That's awesome.
Well, I learned from 21 years.
All right.
I weigh about.
Gotta go though. All right, here we go.
I weigh about 80 kilograms. Most of that, let's say 64%, is water, though you can't tell by looking. I mean, as organisms go, I like to think that I look fairly solid. After water, the next largest proportion of me is protein, about 16%. Not just in my muscles, but also in things like the tiny sodium potassium pumps in my neurons and the hemoglobin in my blood and the enzymes driving the chemical reactions in every one of my 37 trillion cells. And another 16% of me is fat, which I'm totally okay with. 4% of me is minerals like the calcium and phosphorus in my bones and the iron in my blood. And 1% is carbohydrates, most of which is either being consumed as I talk to you or is sitting around as glycogen waiting to be used. But here's the thing. It's not like I just ate 80 kilograms of food and then all this happened. Instead, my body, like yours, is constantly acquiring stuff, extracting some of it to keep, burning some of it for energy, and getting rid of the rest. But even the stuff that my body does hold on to doesn't last forever. Some of the chemicals that I absorb in my food eventually become a part of me, but enzymes wear out and membranes break down and DNA gets oxidized, so they get discarded. And then I need more of those chemicals to reconstruct the material that I've lost. As a result, over the course of my lifetime, my cells will synthesize somewhere between 225 and 450 kilograms of protein. That's like 3 or 4 or 5 separate me's just made of protein. And all the protein and fat and carbohydrates and nucleic acids that make up me, of course, come from food. Every organism has to keep taking in and breaking down food to keep resupplying itself with the raw materials it needs to survive. And all that activity requires energy, which we also gain from food. So how do our bodies actually convert what we eat into energy and raw materials? The answer is a never-ending series of reactions that are dedicated to doing 2 vital and totally contradictory things. One set of chemical reactions destroys the reactants that you give them, reducing big, complex substances into molecular rubble, and the other set reassembles that rubble into new and bigger products that are put together again to make you. So our bodies are constantly reinventing themselves in a perpetual state of loss, but also always rebuilding. And even though all of this is happening at the cellular level, its consequences could hardly be larger. These 2 sets of reactions are where everything that we've learned so far about the digestive, endocrine, circulatory, and respiratory systems really starts to come together. Together, these processes make up your metabolism. sciencey word metabolism has come to have a meaning in popular speech, but metabolism isn't just one thing. People talk about metabolism as meaning like how fast your body burns the fuel in your food or how high your personal energy level is, and that's fine for use by personal trainers and fitness magazines. But physiologically, metabolism really describes every single biochemical reaction that goes on in your body. And maybe more importantly, it reconciles two conflicting chemical processes that are always simultaneously underway inside of you. One of those chemical forces is anabolism. Anabolic reactions construct things and consume energy. These are the processes that take the small monomer building blocks in your food, like monosaccharides and fatty and amino acids, and build them into bigger, more complex polymers like carbs and fats and proteins that are used in your cells. Then, when you need new building blocks or you need to release some energy, those polymers in your body or new ones in your food get broken up by catabolic reactions. The processes of catabolism break down bigger molecules, and in breaking their bonds, release the energy you need to stay warm and move around and provide your cells with fuel to build those polymers back up again. To be honest, your metabolism is a lot like Sisyphus. It works really hard, but it is never finished. And the boulder that your inner Sisyphus is always pushing uphill and watching fall back down, that's nutrients, the molecules that your body is forever breaking up and then rebuilding only to have them break apart again. And these nutrients, the materials that your body needs to build, maintain, and repair itself, come in 6 major groups. By volume, the majority of what we consume and what makes up our bodies is water. So that's maybe the most vital nutrient. Then there are vitamins, compounds that come in either fat-soluble or water-soluble forms. They aren't used as building blocks or for energy, but they're essential in helping the body make use of other nutrients that do those things. Vitamin C, for example, helps improve iron absorption, while vitamin K is crucial to blood clotting, and some B vitamins are important in the production of ATP from glucose. Minerals, like vitamins, don't provide fuel, but they have all sorts of other functions. Calcium, magnesium, and phosphorus harden bones and teeth, while iron is, of course, crucial in hemoglobin. Plus, potassium, sodium, and chlorine help maintain your body's pH balance and are used in action potentials. So water, vitamins, and minerals are all necessary. But the 3 major nutrients that everyone always talks about, the ones you find on food labels from oatmeal to Pop-Tarts, are carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins. Most of the carbohydrates you've ever eaten, with the exception of lactose in milk, originally came from plants. Mono and disaccharides come from fruits, honey, sugar beets, and sugarcane, while polysaccharides, starches, come from veggies and grains. The main thing you need to know is that the monosaccharide glucose is the be-all, end-all molecular fuel that your cells need to make ATP. ATP being the molecule that your cells use to drive anabolic reactions. Need to make new polymers or get anything else done, whether that's operating a sodium-potassium pump or detaching the head of a myosin filament to contract a muscle. But ATP is too unstable to store, so cells often store energy in the form of glucose, which they can then catabolize and convert to ATP when they need it. Now, some of your cells can get their energy from fats, but many of the most important ones, like your neurons and red blood cells, feed exclusively on glucose. So most of the carbs that your intestines absorb are converted to glucose for that reason. But if it's not needed right away, that energy can also get stored as glycogen in your liver and muscles, or converted to glycerol and fatty acids to make triglyceride fats. And even though there seems to be some kind of marketing war going on against dietary fats, we most definitely need them. The fats in your adipose tissue store energy, of course, but they also store fat-soluble vitamins and cushion your organs. Lipids also form the myelin that insulates the neurons in your brain and throughout your body, as well as the oil in your skin, and they provide the vital calorie content found in breast milk. But there are other important lipids like cholesterol, which is the precursor to things like testosterone and estrogen, and of course phospholipids, which form the cell membrane in every single one of the 3 dozen or so trillion cells you have. Now, if you're into eating meat, a lot of the fat you ingest might come from that, but guess what? Plants have fat too. Plants use lipids for energy storage just like we do, except they do it in fruits and nuts and seeds, which, when you think of it, are kind of like plant breast milk. It's food for their growing babies. Either way, though, when you eat lipids, your body breaks down triglycerides into glycerol and fatty acids. Those molecules can then be processed and used in the making of ATP, or they might be converted into other kinds of fatty acids, which your cells can then reassemble into your very own triglycerides or phospholipids. And your liver happens to be great at converting one fatty acid into another, but there are some it just can't synthesize. For example, omega-6 and 3 fatty acids are called essential fatty acids because your body can't make them, so they have to be ingested. They get turned into all kinds of useful molecules, like the ones used for synapse formation in the brain and for signaling inflammation during the healing process. But if carbohydrates provide energy and fats insulate and store energy, then just about everything else is done with proteins. They form the bulk of your muscle and connective tissue, but they're also what the ion channels and pumps are made of in your neurons and muscle cells, and they make up your enzymes, which are responsible for pretty much every chemical reaction in your body. In other words, your body runs on protein and pretty much is protein. Nutritionally speaking, meats, dairy products, eggs, legumes, nuts, cereals are all particularly high in protein. But because everything we eat was once alive and every cell of every living thing contains protein, as long as you're eating whole foods, you're at least partially restocking your protein supplies. That might seem like you'd have to eat muscle to make muscle or eat enzymes to make enzymes, but that's not how it works. Since all your proteins are made up of just 20 amino acids, the differences between the thousands of unique proteins are simply in the sequence of those amino acids. And of course, you have a specialized molecule that knows just which amino acids to put together in what order to make a certain protein. It's called DNA. When you consume some hamburger, for example, the protein actin in the meat gets catabolized into its component amino acids, which gets mixed up with all of the amino acids from all the other proteins in the meat, like the collagen and elastin and chitin and myosin, as well as all of the proteins from the bun and the tomato and the mayonnaise. Those amino acids then get reassembled using anabolic reactions into your very own but somewhat different proteins as defined by your DNA. Each cell is like a picky little Gordon Ramsay, and it has to have every amino acid needed, every ingredient present before it will even think about starting to make a protein. And just like with your lipids, your cells can improvise and convert some amino acids into others if they're missing an ingredient. However, there are 9 essential amino acids that you cannot make from others and have to eat. Now, lots of foods don't provide every essential amino acid, but when you combine foods like beans and rice or pasta and cheese, you do get all of the essential amino acids, which is important because remember, after water, you are mostly made of protein on the order of 16%. But what about the 1% of you, the carbohydrates? How that tiniest fraction of you ends up creating all of the energy is what we'll discover next time. But for now, you learned all about the vital nutrients, including water, vitamins, minerals, carbs, fats, and proteins, as well as how anabolic reactions build structures and require energy, while catabolic reactions tear things apart and release energy. And together, these competing forces form the wonderfully conflicted process known as metabolism. Thank you to our headmaster of learning, Linnea Boyev, and thanks to all of our Patreon patrons whose monthly contributions help make Crash Course possible, not only for themselves, but for everyone, everywhere. If you like Crash Course and want to help us keep making videos like this, you can go to patreon.com/crashcourse. This episode was filmed in the Dr. Cheryl C. Kinney Crash Course studio. It was written by Kathleen Yale, edited by Blake DiPestino, and her consultant is Dr. Brandon Jackson. It was directed by Nicholas Jenkins, edited by Nicole Sweeney. Our sound designer is Michael LaRonda, and the graphics team is Thought Cafe.
Okay, so real quick, I do want to watch that other piece that has the ATP production here. So we're going to look really quickly at the process of glycolysis and the Krebs cycle, but we're not going to quite get there just yet. First, I want to review the parts of our metabolism. Cue that up for in just a minute. So let's go ahead and look at like metabolism again. I know we already have this in our notes, but metabolism, any and all chemical reactions that are taking place within the body, right? So it's all of them. It's a chemical reaction that breaks something down so that you have ingredients to build something up, or it's the chemical reaction of building something up, or it's the chemical reaction of breaking something down to release energy, or the process of using that energy to build something up. So it's a constant like back and forth process. It goes in one of 2 directions. Nothing ever goes directly lateral. This is why, like, when sometimes you'll hear people say, like, oh, you got to turn your fat into muscle. It doesn't work that way. You can turn your fat into energy, give your body ingredients, and then your body can build muscle using that energy. You cannot actually make fat into muscle. It doesn't directly work that way. So our 2 parts that we've got here are catabolism, which is the breaking down of complex compounds into their simpler breaking down compounds into simpler compounds. Yeah, I guess so. I mean, they're still compounds. I hate it when they use that twice in the same sentence. We are going to take something that is really complex and we're going to break it down into something that is much, much smaller and much simpler, right? So for instance, an example would be taking, breaking carbohydrates into monosaccharides for energy production, right? That's a really great example. We've also got anabolic reactions, right? Which are going to be, which is going to build simpler compounds into needed substances by the body. I'm gonna say that just because that makes it just a little clearer. So this is gonna take something that's, you know, really simple and build it up into something complex. So an example of this would be building up monosaccharides into, God dang it, every time, double C, not double R. Building up monosaccharides into glycogen to be used for energy later, right? So it's funny, like we could just consume big complex carbohydrates, but because they're so complex, we can't get them into our we can't get them into our bloodstream. And so catabolically, you're going to break that down into sugar. And then anabolically, you're either going to use that sugar for energy or you're going to convert it into one of two forms. You're going to convert it into glycogen, hopefully. And that's going to be, you know, just stay in its carbohydrate form, but linked to a bunch of other carbohydrates, or it's going to be converted into fat and stored that way to be used later. But either way, those are the differences between, or those are two examples of anabolic and catabolic reactions. Okay, so now we got to look at the idea of like cellular respiration. Now that we kind of understand like the basics of going in this way or going in this way, we got to look at actually building up molecules of ATP, right? So how do we take glucose and convert it into this high energy molecule that we can use? Well, this is where the idea of cellular respiration comes in. And I love that I always love to draw like the parallel between how it's named cellular respiration. And then what we do is we have our version of respiration like on the large, right? Like I'm bringing in trillions of oxygen molecules every time I breathe into my lungs, right? And the point of that is so that those oxygen molecules get carried by my red blood cells to wherever it is they need to go and keep a cell alive. That cell is then going to absorb that oxygen molecule, and it's going to spit out a little bit of ATP as long as it has glucose as an ingredient. So that's what we're going to look at here. We're going to look at how we take glucose and how we take in oxygen and use both of those things to produce the currency that our entire body runs on. Skip that. And here we go. And this is definitely something that animations really help with because sometimes he's going to start throwing a lot of numbers around. I actually don't need you guys to know these numbers, by the way. Like you can see, in fact, the numbers might even be a little different than the ones we see here. I can't remember like what he uses, but ATP production is not always perfect. Like sometimes it's going to be around 32 molecules of ATP for every glucose. Sometimes it'll be 34. Depends on how like energy efficient your cells are. But seeing the this is like we've been building towards this. Like the whole class comes down to so right here.
Here's a couple of words you might find useful in the study of human metabolism. They also happen to be two words that I enjoy in general. Lunch, buffet. I'd go in all you can eat, but that's kind of implied, and then it would be 6 words unless you hyphenate them. But still, brunch buffet. You got eggs and bacon and French toast and biscuits and fruit and some kind of weird sorted jello thing in there. And once you've paid your $12.99, you know there's a pretty good chance that it's all going to get eaten. But here's the thing. Not everything that you fit into your face during brunch time is going to be handled the same way by your body. After you're done digesting, some nutrients will go straight to your body's pile of stuff to burn right away, but others will have to be converted into something else. For example, the carbs and fats in your buttered toast can be directly oxidized into useful energy. The amino acids in the bacon have to be converted into molecules that get broken down like carbs if you want to get energy out of them. And while excess carbs and fats can be stored in larger polymer versions of their original forms, any extra amino acids can't be. They have to be converted and then stored as fat or glycogen. So as I've mentioned before, the molecules in your body are constantly changing shape and renewing and rearranging themselves to either build things or to use energy. And eating food replenishes these nutrients, especially glucose. Then, depending on what your body needs and when you last ate, certain hormones like insulin will help decide what to burn and what to store for later. This, of course, is an important function, which is why things can go badly if this process doesn't work properly because of a metabolic disorder like diabetes. In that case, your body can't properly use and store nutritional energy, which makes the very acts of eating and metabolizing more difficult and possibly dangerous. Exactly how glucose levels can spike or plummet, how we convert nutrients into energy, and how all of that relates to eating and hunger and weight, metabolism, and your health in general is, guess what? Complicated. But as you are a living thing that must eat in order to stay alive, I'd say it's worth learning how it works. And brunch is as good a place to start as any. Waiting in line for the all-you-can-eat brunch buffet is a good time to recall the law of conservation of energy. The law simply states that energy can never be created or destroyed, it can only change forms. And the process of metabolism involves conversions of energy, either through catabolizing reactions that release the energy stored in your food, or anabolizing ones that use or store that energy. So you can enjoy your short stack of flapjacks and biscuits and gravy, but remember, that energy has to either get released or stored somewhere inside you. Now, the conversion of food energy is part of the great balancing act that is maintaining homeostasis, and one of its greatest tricks is cellular respiration. Cellular respiration is how we derive energy from the food we eat, specifically glucose, which is where most of our food ends up. In order for glucose to become energy we can use, we have to give it some oxygen and convert each sugar molecule into 6 molecules of CO2 and 6 molecules of water, which usually produces about 32 molecules of ATP. Cellular respiration occurs in 3 simultaneous phases, where glucose is broken down by glycolysis and other catabolic reactions, and then turned into pyruvic acid and acetyl-CoA, and finally ushered into the Krebs cycle. It's all pretty complicated, but we covered it extensively in Crash Course Biology, so rather than getting into the blow-by-blow here, I recommend you check out that video for a refresher. For now, just remember that cellular respiration breaks down nutrient molecules to generate ATP, and in doing so, it captures some of the chemical energy that was in those bonds for use in your body. Now, when it comes to how that energy is converted and where, that depends largely on when you ate your last meal. We all switch back and forth between 2 nutritional states, the absorptive or fed state, which is during or after eating, and the post-absorptive or fasting state, when the GI tract is empty and the body is running off of stored supplies. So say you're just post-brunch buffet and you're still in the absorptive state, unbuckling your belt as your digestive system breaks up the eggs and bacon and French toast and syrup into a bunch of mostly glucose molecules that pass into your bloodstream. The first bit of glucose gets delivered throughout the body and is tapped to generate ATP on the spot through cellular respiration. But since the meal was big and rich, there's more glucose floating around than your cells need at the moment. And remember, ATP is too unstable to be used for storage, which means all the extra glucose is going to get stored as fat or glycogen. And that storage is part of how you can end up gaining weight, because how much energy gets stored depends partly on your basal metabolic rate. That's the number of daily calories your body needs to do business as usual. And that rate can be influenced by your age, your sex, and body size or composition. A young bodybuilder is going to burn way more calories than that tiny grandma, but generally, if you're absorbing more nutrients than you're burning, you will gain weight. So yeah, for that, you can blame the law of conservation of energy. Now, of course, all nutrients are important. I mean, your body is basically made of protein, so that's kind of key. But in terms of immediate fuel, glucose is the easiest source of food for cells like your neurons, and it is always a good policy to keep your brain well fed so it doesn't get hangry or dead. So your body likes to maintain a blood glucose level of 70 to 100 milligrams per deciliter. But let's say that thanks to the buffet, you've now got 140 milligrams per deciliter. This means too much sugar is swimming around in your blood, and your body isn't happy about it. If your blood sugar levels get too high, it can damage blood vessels, especially those in the nervous system, heart, kidneys, eyes, and extremities. That's why diabetes is often associated with a higher risk of heart and kidney disease, loss of vision, and foot amputation. But typically, rising blood sugar levels sets off a series of events that trim them back down. Specifically, they trigger special beta cells in the pancreas to start secreting more of the hormone that regulates everything that happens when you're in the absorptive state. And this hormone is the all-powerful insulin. Insulin's job in this instance is to move glucose out of the blood and into storage. And to do that, it triggers a shift from catabolic reactions to anabolic ones. For example, it puts a stop to glycogenolysis, or breaking down glycogen in your liver and muscles to release glucose for energy, and instead ramps up the process of glycogenesis, where extra glucose is linked together to form glycogen. It also activates lipogenesis, where very cool chemical reactions in the liver convert glucose to triglycerides and then ship them off to your adipose tissue for storage. A similar thing happens with the extra fatty acids that you got from the eggs and bacon that aren't immediately needed for energy. They get processed through lipogenesis too and are rebuilt back into triglycerides and then tucked away for a rainy day. The thing is, if you're thinking about this, all these lipids hate water, right? Fat and water don't mix. So you should be asking yourself, how can they be transported in the blood when they're so hydrophobic? The answer is lipoproteins, 4 specialized proteins made by the liver that surround fats and allow them to move in the bloodstream as an emulsion. You've probably heard of some of these. One is low-density lipoprotein, also known as LDL cholesterol. It's what delivers some of the glucose and fat that you just ate to your body's fat deposits. Another is high-density lipoprotein, or HDL cholesterol, which is the good cholesterol. It starts out as an empty protein packet sent out by the liver to gather up other cholesterols from the blood and artery walls and other cells. HDL then delivers the cholesterol back to the liver or to places like the ovaries, testes, and adrenal glands, which use it to make steroid hormones. All right, so now your body has put all the glucose and lipids and proteins where they need to go, and you can just coast into the post-absorptive state. But several hours later, even though your small intestine is still working on what's left of the buffet, your cells have been helping themselves to the remaining glucose in the blood, and eventually your blood sugar level will start to drop. Remember, your neurons are on an exclusive glucose meal plan, so they need sugar at the ready. And if your body senses an imbalance in blood sugar levels, it sounds the alarm. A decrease in glucose stimulates alpha cells in the pancreas to release insulin's nemesis, the hormone glucagon. It starts raising the blood sugar level by triggering the liver and adipose tissues to metabolize their fat and glycogen stores, thereby releasing fatty acids, glycerol, and glucose back into the blood. But if it's been a day or two since you've eaten, for some reason, and you've burned through both your blood glucose and your glycogen stores, and you don't have any sugars left to feed your brain, in that case, your body will launch into gluconeogenesis and convert fats and amino acids into glucose, so ATP synthesis can continue in your brain cells. This process is a sort of last-ditch effort by the body to protect the nervous system from the damaging effects of low blood sugar. Now, of course, this whole system has its flaws, and one of them is that the whole setup is almost entirely dependent on the proper release and reception of insulin. People with diabetes either don't produce enough insulin or have abnormal receptors for it, which is why they often have to inject a pharmaceutical version of the chemical after eating. Otherwise, their blood sugar levels will remain too high, and they'll start peeing out large amounts of glucose to try and balance the levels in the blood. The problem is, because glucose is being excreted and not stored, it's not available when the blood sugar starts to drop. So the body has to draw on fat and protein tissues for energy, which is one reason why sudden weight loss can be an early sign of diabetes. Whether you're diabetic or not, I think we can all agree that it is important to respect your blood sugar levels and remember to continue feeding the beast. But at brunch, just, use small plates. Try to keep the trips to the buffet line under 5 or so. Today, you learned how your body uses energy from food, including through cellular respiration, which converts glucose into ATP, glycogenesis, which converts it to glycogen, and lipogenesis, which converts it to triglycerides. And you also learned how insulin regulates your sugar levels. Thank you to our headmaster of learning, Linnea Boyev, and thank you to all of our Patreon patrons whose monthly contributions help make Crash Course possible, not only for themselves, but for everyone, everywhere. If you like Crash Course and want to help us keep making videos like this one, you can go to patreon.com/crashcourse. This episode was filmed in the Dr. Cheryl C. Kinney Crash Course studio. It was written by Kathleen Yale, edited by Blake DiPastino, and our consultant is Dr. Brandon Jackson. It was directed by Nicholas Jenkins, edited by Nicole Sweeney. Our sound designer is Michael Aranda, and the graphics team is Thought Cafe.
Okay. That was the last Crash Course video for a while, by the way. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at cellular respiration here. So this is the stuff that sometimes, like I said, can feel a little complicated, but we're going to be moving. We're not going to be going super in depth into like each individual piece today. That's sort of for our other classes, but we need to have a little bit of a foundational. So when we describe cellular respiration, it describes how the body's cells take in nutrients such as glucose and oxygen and use it to produce ATP, right? So glucose and oxygen go in, and carbon dioxide and ATP come out, right? So when we're looking at this, we've got a couple different pieces of cellular respiration, right? Like if we're looking at like a single molecule of glucose, right? You can see it's got 6 pieces of carbon. Like if I pull up a picture of glucose here, you can see here, that's not a great picture. That didn't have any of the carbons on it. Here is a picture of what we're looking at, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So that is a carbohydrate. This is a molecule of glucose, right? So what's going to happen is through the process of cellular respiration, we're going to take those 6 carbons and we're going to convert them into molecules of ATP. So in the process, the first part of cellular respiration is always going to be a process called glycolysis. And glycolysis is sort of like our version of like a booster button. Like this is our intense, high energy ATP production section. Like glycolysis is how we do all of our very intense work. So as long as you are like working really, really hard, you're going to start with glycolysis. And there's going to be two really cool things that happen here. Number one, you're going to produce some ATP. But you're actually not going to produce that much ATP, or at least you're not going to produce that much ATP at a time. For every molecule of glucose, you're only going to get about 2 molecules of ATP, which is not very much in comparison to what we're going to see in a second. But what you are also going to be left with is a whole bunch of what are called pyruvates. This is known as pyruvic acid. And so those pyruvates are, you can see the carbon here actually. They're left with 3 individual carbons each, right? And then what's going to happen is, because of where glycolysis takes place, that pyruvic acid is actually going to ferment. So glycolysis takes place in that liquid portion of the cell that we've been talking about, called your cytoplasm, right? Remember, the cytoplasm is the goo inside of your cells. Your cells are kind of this wet, swampy area. So this actually, a lot of times when you're hearing, you're talking about ATP production, you spend a lot of time talking about the mitochondria, right? Like the mitochondria, you always hear it, they're the powerhouse of the cell. That's where we're producing our ATP, right? Like that's how our cells take in and produce energy. And that is still true, but there is a little bit of energy production that takes place outside of the mitochondria in the fluid portion of the cell. That's your cytoplasm. And that's a good thing, right? Like it's, we've been doing that for forever, since before we had mitochondria, in our cells as a little one-celled critter. But like what's going to happen, because that's pyruvic acid is in a non-oxygen environment, it's in a wet, swampy environment, there's no oxygen in there, that pyruvic acid starts to ferment. And when you think of like fermentation, you should be thinking of things like sourdough bread and kimchi and kombucha and beer and wine, right? Like all of those things are where you're taking sugar and fermenting it into alcohol. Well, we're taking it and we are converting into what is called citric acid, or in our version, we're going to call it lactic acid, right? So lactic acid is what happens when pyruvic acid ferments in a non-oxygen environment. So what you end up what you get is that those pyruvates get converted into lactic acid, which are now going to be able to be split up through this big long wheel full of all these enzymatic reactions called the Krebs cycle. And the Krebs cycle is the first thing that happens in your mitochondria. So all of that lactic acid has fermented, and now it moves into the mitochondria. And the mitochondria is going to take that lactic acid, it's going to add some oxygen and oxidize that lactic acid and convert it into 2 more molecules of ATP, which is pretty cool, right? Like now we end up with a little bit more ATP. But that's still not a ton, right? Like we had a molecule of glucose, we got 2 ATP from glycolysis, and we got 2 more in the mitochondria from the Krebs cycle. But just like in glycolysis, how we converted glucose into lactic acid, and that lactic acid was necessary to do the Krebs cycle, well, now we are going to take the Krebs cycle's byproducts, which are going to be these really high energy molecules called NAD and FAD. And that NAD and FAD, they have a whole bunch of extra little hydrogens on them. And those are going to get squeezed through this little pump and add a little bit more oxygen. And what's going to happen is we're going to spit out about 30 more ATP molecules. And that's all from that original glucose molecule, right? So we took in glucose, we converted it into a little bit of ATP and some lactic acid. That lactic acid went through the Krebs cycle. We turned that into a little more ATP and a little bit of what's called NAD and FAD. And then NAD and FAD went in through what's called the electron transport chain. That's the final section. And that electron transport chain spit out 30 molecules of ATP. So that's all very complicated. And, we do actually break that down in other classes, when we can spend a whole day on it. But for today, we're just going to look at the very simple versions. So first one we're looking at is glycolysis, right? And so this is going to be an anaerobic, actually, you know what I'm going to do? Let's split this up this way. Anaerobic respiration is going to consist of glycolysis, right? And glycolysis is going to be how our body produces ATP in the cytoplasm of our cells. Oops. To yield 2 ATP per molecule of glucose. And then what we're going to see is that pyruvic acid is a byproduct. And actually, those are sometimes called pyruvates. So I'll put that up here just for some of you who've seen that term. So pyruvic acid is a byproduct, right? So we use a little bit of glycolysis. This is what you're experiencing, by the way. Like when you start exercising, like let's say you're going for a jog, right? And you're nice and warmed up. Like you've been at it for more than 5 minutes at this point. You know, you've been going for a while. So now like you're jogging and everything's fine, right? You're producing plenty of energy as you go, and you're also processing all of that energy. But then all of a sudden you start going uphill and it's like, I'm going to keep the same pace. And then you're starting to go uphill. And now what's starting to happen is like your legs are starting to burn more, you're breathing more, and then like you're breathing more and your heart rate's going even faster and faster. And then eventually there's this tipping point where you're like, man, my legs are burning even more and I'm breathing more, but like the burning is starting to outpace my breathing, right? Like this is officially burning more than like I can handle, right? Well, that's where you're starting to become anaerobic. That's actually where you are starting to have such a large buildup of lactic acid that those other processes, these aerobic parts of your metabolism, they can't process anymore. So you're still producing lactic acid thanks to your anaerobic metabolism. But normally that lactic acid would get converted into ATP with your aerobic metabolism. But in this case, it can't anymore because you can only bring in so many molecules of oxygen and you've only got so many mitochondria and you've only got so much hemoglobin to deliver all that oxygen. So what ends up happening is you get a little bit of lactic acid left over in the end, and it sits there and it burns like crazy. And then a little bit of time passes and it keeps building up more and more and more and more until eventually you have to slow down. And when you slow down, maybe you start walking up that hill, right? What's going to happen is you're still breathing just as hard as you were before. Like you're continued to breathe even though your intensity just immediately dropped, right? Like let's say you decide to stop, and you're just sitting there like, right? Like all that breathing, you're bringing in oxygen and all that oxygen is going straight to your cells. So all that lactic acid is like, great, well, I'm not making any more lactic acid. Like we're done. We stopped moving. I'm not using any more. I'm not generating any more ATP. We're just going to convert all that lactic acid that we had into ATP. And so then it burns off all that lactic acid through that aerobic metabolism. And this is actually why, if you've ever done, anybody in here has ever experienced this, if you do intense cardio where like you do build up that lactic acid, you do work really hard, like don't get me wrong, you're gonna feel kind of wiped out and tired after you're done. But if you cool down properly and you process all of that lactic acid the right way, a lot of times people will be like, I feel great, I could go again right now. Like, and you leave the gym with more energy than you came with, which makes a lot of sense because you literally have produced more energy than you came with. So you're left with all this like extra energy afterwards. Eventually you're gonna burn through it and you're gonna crash pretty hard because your brain has got all this like adenosine left over, which is gonna bind to the parts of your brain that go, okay, well, we did work, so now it's time to recover. So don't get me wrong, you're definitely going to get tired, but like this is actually exactly why if you manage your clients' energy production properly and you give your clients the right type of rest and you give your clients the right work periods and you warm your clients up and you cool your clients down, a lot of times at the end of their sessions, they'll be like, that's it, we're done. I feel great. Oh my God, I feel so awesome. Let's do it. All right, thanks. See ya. And they leave feeling really, really great, which is awesome for you because that means that they're gonna wanna keep training. Raul, how you doing so far? This is your first time on this stuff. How you feeling?
It's pretty. I don't know. It's pretty interesting, but
Yeah, it will get less vague, I promise. It's just that we don't have a ton of time to spend on just these energy production. We literally have 12 days dedicated to energy production. Like these guys just went through that actually before you joined in. So we are going to talk about this, but we're going to talk more about just like the types of energy in the large as it relates to working out here in just a minute.
okay.
But end of the day, you need glucose. That's the big thing to remember here. So glycolysis is an anaerobic process. It does not require oxygen. It happens in the cytoplasm, right? Now, aerobic processes, they do require oxygen, right? Aerobic respiration. These are processes that do require oxygen. I'll actually put that up here. So we'll say anaerobic respiration is metabolic processes that, or no, say ATP production that does not require oxygen. And then your aerobic respiration are ATP production that requires oxygen. So there's the difference, right? You've got the in the cytoplasm part, and you've got the in the mitochondria part. This uses oxygen, this does not. So the first part of your aerobic respiration is going to use the byproducts from your anaerobic, right? So we actually need to go through that. This is why lactic acid, by the way, is a good thing. Like, I know we all hate lactic acid, you know, in the sense that like it makes us sore and we're like, oh God, freaking lactic acid, you did me in again, you know? I know that like that's a totally like reasonable thing, but we super need lactic acid. Like, thank goodness we produce lactic acid because it's a byproduct of that first process that is an ingredient in the next process. So we need it in order to be able to do these other processes. And this is where most of the actual energy production takes place. So your aerobic respiration, which is the stuff that does require oxygen, is going to be the first section is going to be what is called your Krebs cycle, which is sometimes also known as the citric acid cycle. So both of those, sometimes you'll see those names kind of used interchangeably. It's named after the guy who discovered it, Hans Krebs, or it's named after, like, you know, the fact that he uses citric acid. So this is going to be this is going to describe how our body produces ATP in the mitochondria using the byproducts of glycolysis. So that's really what we're seeing here, right? Like glycolysis produces these byproducts in the form of lactic acid. That lactic acid gets converted into a molecule that we can then use to produce ATP, right? So what ends up happening here is we end up producing NAD and FAD as a byproduct. Oh my God, typing. Byproduct. And then our last section is what's called the electron transport chain, right? And this is going to describe how our body, how our body produces ATP in the mitochondria using the byproducts of glycolysis. Yeah, you know, I'm gonna put the numbers up. Yeah, this is gonna give us about 2 more. Produces 2 more ATP in the mitochondria using the byproducts of glycolysis. There we go. And then NAD and FAD are byproducts. And so the electron transport chain describes how our body produces around 32 ATP in the mitochondria using the byproducts of the Krebs cycle. So this is how we're doing that. Like, we're getting a ton of ATP here, right? And then what we're going to see is CO2 and water are byproducts, right? So you're going to end up with a little bit of CO2 afterwards, and that's what you need to exhale out of your lungs because your cells exhaled them out of their bodies, right? So let's go ahead and look at this here, right? Like if we look at glycolysis into the Krebs cycle, into the electron transport chain. Give me one picture, Google. Come on, help me out. Oh, actually, never mind. I like this one better. Okay. So let's track a molecule of glucose here, right? So a molecule of glucose is going to go out in through glycolysis and spit out some ATP, as well as a little bit of pyruvate. And then that pyruvate is going to go into its processing, where it's going to get converted into what the Krebs cycle can actually use. We're calling it the citric acid cycle here, right? And that citric acid cycle is going to take, once it's become lactic acid and then it's become acetyl-CoA, it's going to go through the cycle here. By the way, that cycle is very complicated, but it's really cool. This is why we mention our B vitamins, actually. If we look at the Krebs cycle, you can see it actually uses all these crazy little enzymes. Like this is what the citric acid cycle actually looks like when you zoom in on it. Oh, good, black background. God dang it. No. There we go. So this is actually... Killing me, internet. All right, look at this. Look at how freaking crazy complicated this is. And look at the name of these enzymes, right? Isocitrate dehydrogenase. Blah, right? Crazy big, long enzyme names here. But what's really cool about this, like all these processes happening, is it's just cleaving off a little bit of NAD and a little bit of FAD, right? Those NAD and FAD. Those things that are eventually going to go through the electron transport chain to produce a ton of ATP. So we're really glad that it's going through this process. Now, remember, enzymes, right? Enzymes kick off chemical reactions. Well, all those crazy enzymes I just mentioned in the Krebs cycle, you know where we get them from? Our B vitamins. Those are actually the big complicated enzyme names for our B vitamins. Like that's why B vitamins act as what we call coenzymes, because they're there to help the Krebs cycle do its job. And that's why you hear people say like B vitamins, they give you energy. That's not necessarily true because B vitamins don't have any calories in them. So they don't actually have any energy. But they do act as coenzymes that allow us to use energy more effectively, right? So they're definitely like a big part of the conversation. But to be fair, they don't have any real energy of their own. So, all right, so let's go back. Glucose becomes pyruvate. Pyruvate becomes what's called acetyl-CoA, right? That's going to be, and then lactic acid is in there in the middle. And then that's going to go through the Krebs cycle, right? The Krebs cycle is going to spit out some NAD and FAD, as well as a little bit of ATP, right? So we get a little bit of ATP from there. We got ATP from glycolysis. We got ATP from the citric acid cycle. We got 2 from here. We got 2 from here. It's not very much, right? But we got a whole bunch of NAD and we have a whole bunch of FAD, which have all these little, you know, protons on them that can get squeezed together, and then the electrons that kind of come with that are going to get all squeezed together as well, and it's going to go through this big chain called the electron transport chain, and that is going to spit out 32 molecules of ATP. So we're going to get a ton of that. Meanwhile, more oxygen's coming in, and a little bit of water is actually coming out. Some of the hydrogen from that electron transport chain is going to get attached to that oxygen to make H2O. So we're going to lose a little bit of water here, and we're going to spit out, I don't know why they're not showing it, but we're going to also spit out some CO2. So those are your byproducts. Your byproducts here are H2O and CO2, a little bit of water, a little bit of carbon dioxide. But the product is just a ton of ATP, right? Here's kind of another really fun picture. You can kind of see like how we're getting different bits of ATP, right? You're basically getting a yield of about 36 molecules of ATP for every molecule of glucose, right? Glycolysis gives you 2. The Krebs cycle is going to give you an additional 2, so you're going to be up to 4. But then it's also going to produce some NAD and FAD, which are all going to total up to about 32 together. So the 4 plus 32 gives us a total of 36. That's kind of an interesting picture. I'm not sure I interpreted that picture perfectly right, but I described it right. That's what we're seeing there. That is how we're producing ATP. We will go over that and make it make so much more sense in later classes. And I know for those of you who are like watching, or those of you who have already heard this, you're like, oh yeah. It gets more detailed later on. But that is basically respiration. That basically describes how we're producing this high energy molecule. Now, what's funny is we've talked all about producing ATP, but we haven't really talked too much about what ATP is itself. So let's really quickly, before we move in any further, let's talk about what adenosine triphosphate actually is. So adenosine triphosphate, or ATP, is a high energy molecule that consists of a molecule of adenosine attached to 3 phosphates, okay? And there is a ton of energy trapped between the bonds of those phosphates, particularly the second and last phosphate. So a molecule of ATP, right, if we look at it, it looks like this, adenosine triphosphate. If we look at it, we usually draw it as just like, you know, an A and 3 P's. There we go. And so it kind of looks like this, right? You can see there's a little sugar that holds them together. But here's your adenosine triphosphate, right? So you get your adenosine molecule here, 3 little phosphates. So these 3 little phosphates, there's a ton of energy trapped in between these bonds. And so what happens is your body breaks this bond right here and kicks this final phosphate off. So when it kicks that phosphate off, what ends up happening is energy gets released, and that energy is going to be trapped by your body cells to do work. So whenever we bind ATP to like a protein or something, it encourages that protein to like change shape and break that molecule and do work. So for instance, if we look at like how ATP attaches to a myosin head, right? If we look at like inside of our muscle and we look at like this whole process here, take a look, there's ATP right there, right? Now they're labeling it as, actually here's ATP. We'll start down here in step 3 actually. So here's where ATP actually comes and attaches, right? And so when that new molecule of ATP attaches, the myosin head detaches. It actually causes the myosin to let go. That flushes all the calcium out, and now the muscle goes back into a resting position. And then what your body's going to do is that ATP molecule is going to be split. It's going to kick that 3rd phosphate off, right? Breaks the 3rd phosphate away. Now you're left with what's called ADP, or adenosine diphosphate, and that's 2 phosphates instead of 3. So now there's ADP and a phosphate there, and that whole bunch of energy is going to kind of be there and stored. And then when you want to like attach that actin and myosin, it's going to use all the energy that it broke down and captured earlier. So when it broke this, it captures a whole bunch of energy. And now it's got that energy stored, and it's going to use it to reach up and grab and create that sliding action inside of our muscles. Then it's going to detach that and wait for the next molecule of ATP to come in. When that next molecule of ATP comes in, it attaches. That encourages that myosin head to let go. And then it gets ready for its next stroke. And while it's getting ready, it breaks that phosphate off, uses the stored energy. And then when the next stroke comes, boom, it reaches up and grabs. Another molecule of ADP comes in. And the process continues repeating over and over and over and over and over again. That's happening in your muscles. It's happening to a sodium-potassium pump. Remember how we generate action potentials, right? We use that really cool little sodium-potassium pump that pushes sodium ions and potassium ions in different directions in order to generate electricity, right? Well, how the heck did that pump have the energy to move? It got it from ATP. So a molecule of ATP is going to come over here and it's going to bind. And what will happen is it'll leave one of those phosphates behind and break off, right? So now you break the bond, you're left with ADP, right? You kick that third phosphate off. And when that happens, that encourages this protein to change shape, which causes sodium to rush in, potassium to rush out, or whatever direction it happens to be going. And then it'll detach that and wait for the next molecule of ATP to come in, and it'll change shape again. So, you know, it sits like this. ATP burns up its energy. It changes its shape to that. The next molecule comes and attaches, and then it goes back to its normal shape. And then it breaks off that ATP again, changes shape, attaches, change shape, attaches. And so it's just constantly pumping in different directions. And that's all happening because of ATP. It happens in every single thing that you do. All of it requires ATP. So adenosine triphosphate is the super high energy molecule that has a bunch of energy trapped within it. And that's really kind of how that's happening. So let's go ahead and look at our metabolism in the large, right? Let's look at how we sort of produce energy on the go. And so your metabolic rate, right? This is kind of describing a little bit about what we looked at yesterday, but it is the rate at which energy is released from nutrients in our cells, right? So we're describing like how many calories, you know, because calories are a unit of measurement for energy, right? It's how we measure the amount of energy in something. So your metabolic rate is the number of calories that you burn every day. It's the amount of energy you burn every day. We do know that it is going to decrease with age, but we measure it in calories, right? It says kilocalories here, which is true, but again, we're in the US, so we're just going to use an uppercase calorie. That is the amount of heat energy required to raise 1 kilogram of water 1 degree Celsius. So our main source of energy, so when we look at like metabolism, right, our main source of energy is from glucose, right? And so we store glucose in the form of glycogen in the liver and muscle cells, right? So we love to use glucose. Glucose can go through that glycolysis, it can go through the Krebs cycle, and we can use it to produce ATP. And this is why we need to have carbs in our diet, because carbs are big, complicated chains of glucose. Now, we can also use fatty acids and glycerols as well. We can use fats to produce ATP as well, but we can't do it with glycolysis. What'll happen is fats will basically skip straight over glycolysis and go straight into the Krebs cycle by being converted into that acetyl-CoA that we mentioned earlier. So fats can go through the Krebs cycle and produce a bunch of NAD and FAD, but they can't go through glycolysis, which is why we know that like fat is what supplies us with energy during like low intensity duration, long duration exercise, or even like what you guys are doing right now. Like you guys are just chilling, right? Like we're standing here upright, like we're just hanging out, right? This is not a very high energy activity. So right now we're mostly burning fatty acids for metabolism. But if you were to start running, what's going to end up happening is like a higher percentage of calories are going to come from carbohydrates until eventually you're recruiting as many muscle cells as you can and you're working as hard as you can. When that happens, you are officially using glycolysis primarily for your energy production. And that's why like that's our short duration, high intensity exercise, whereas like fat metabolism is our low duration, high duration, low intensity exercise. So they have like a backwards relationship. As your intensity climbs, the percentage of calories that you're burning from carbohydrates increases. And as your intensity declines, your percentage of calories from fats increases. Now that might make you think, well, then I want to exercise at low intensity, right? Like I'm trying to burn fat. But the problem with that is you don't burn very many calories when you're burning fat. It just doesn't burn that often. Like you're not burning very many calories right now, but again, if you were to go for a jog, you would burn a lot of calories. So maybe it's only, let's say it's 60% of your calories are coming from carbohydrates, but you're burning 1,000 calories Actually, you'd be burning way less than that. I need to make up some fake numbers, and I'm so bad with them. Let's see here. Let's say you're burning 70% of your calories from carbohydrates, and you're burning 1,000 calories per hour, right? 1,000 times 0.7, that's going to be 700 calories from carbohydrates and 300 calories from fat. So that's a pretty distinct, that's a big difference, right? Like that's more than twice as many carbohydrate calories. And your goal was to burn fat, right? But let's say instead you end up working at like a really, really, really low intensity, like you're sitting on the couch, right? Or maybe you're just going for a very, very, very gentle walk. Well, that's only going to burn maybe 150, 200 calories per hour, even though 90% of it will come from fat. So let's say we'll be generous. Let's say 200 calories, right? Per hour there. And we'll say that 90% of it is from fat. So times 0.9, that's only going to be 180 fat calories compared to the 300 fat calories you burned earlier. So yes, the percentage is lower, but the number of actual calories is also way, way lower. And that's definitely not something we want when it comes to like, burning off our fat cells. Now, our other sources of energy that they're mentioning here is amino acids. Now, you cannot use amino acids directly for metabolism. It doesn't work that way. You can't take an amino acid and convert it into ATP. You can take fat and convert it into ATP. You can take carbohydrates, you can convert it into ATP. But proteins can't because they've got that nitrogen on them. And that nitrogen prevents them from being converted into ATP. But if you strip that nitrogen away, let's say you take that nitrogen out of there, well, now all you're left with is you're left with carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, which are the three ingredients found in carbohydrates. So you can convert an amino acid into a molecule of glucose by stripping its nitrogen away. And then you are left with glucose. And now that glucose can go through normal metabolism. But you've got all this leftover nitrogen afterwards, which means you're going to have more urea in your pee. It's going to raise your pH, and your kidneys have to process it. So is it a good choice? Not necessarily. I mean, if you don't have kidney problems, I guess it's fine. But if you do have kidney problems, watch your protein intake. All right. So we do have like minerals are going to play a big important role here as well. So minerals, right? Chemical elements that aid in metabolism, right? They give the body structure, assist in fluid balance, muscle contractions, blood clotting, etc. So obviously minerals are really, really important, right? These are things like iron is a mineral, right? We definitely need to have iron in our diet because that's what gives our hemoglobin the protein. That's what gives hemoglobin iron molecules to attach oxygen to. We know that we need calcium in order to give our bones structure. We know that we need sodium and potassium to generate nerve impulses. All these things are really, really important. And then we also have our vitamins here. So vitamins are also going to be really important. These are complex substances that aid in metabolism. And you got two forms here when it comes to vitamins. You're going to have your water soluble, which are vitamins that are transported and dissolved in water. And these are going to be things like vitamin C and B complex. So all of your B vitamins are water-soluble vitamins, and so is vitamin C. And so that is going to assist in your B vitamins, actually. So B vitamins will act as coenzymes during the Krebs cycle, right? So we actually need those B vitamins in order to assist us with ATP production. This is why it's so important to get them in your diet. And then you're also going to have your, and then you're also going to have your fat-soluble vitamins. And your fat-soluble vitamins are vitamins that are transported and dissolved in fat. And so these are vitamins A, D, E, and K. and they assist in the utilization of minerals, and they assist in physiologic processes, and some act as antioxidants to stabilize free radicals. So we love our vitamins because they're there to help in certain, you need vitamin K to assist in blood clotting. You need vitamin E to assist with skin health. You need vitamin A to assist with eye health. Like all of these like fat soluble vitamins are there to ensure that like other physiologic processes can take place. So we already talked about this yesterday. You're actually seeing a higher percentage here though. So I'm not gonna have you guys pay too much attention to these numbers, but when it comes to getting your macronutrients in, that's gonna be about 55 to 60% carbohydrates is what they're saying here. Normal USDA recommendations are 45 to 65%. Fat is going to be between 20 and 30%, and protein is also is going to be somewhere between 15 to 30%. So those are some numbers that you're definitely going to want to pay more attention to from yesterday's lecture rather than this one. Carbohydrates, we've already gone over this, but they are in the form of simple sugars or complex carbs. So those are things like starches and plant fibers. Those are your complex carbs. Simple sugars are literally already in their sugar form, so your body doesn't have to work very hard to break them down. Ideally, when it comes to your diet, you want to focus on mostly complex carbohydrates. You want to make sure that you're getting plenty of fibers and things that do break down slowly, because they're going to have less of a glycemic effect on your blood sugar levels. Blood sugar levels spike, well, your body's going to have to process all that sugar right away. If it has to process it quickly, what ends up happening is it either gets converted into glycogen, hopefully, or it'll get converted into fat. And that's not really what we want to have happen. Then you get your fats, right? We're going to have two different versions. You've got saturated and unsaturated. Saturated fats are the ones that are coming from animal sources, or generally tend to, and they're very solid at room temperature. These are the ones that tend to like be associated with our bad cholesterols. And then you've got unsaturated fats, which we're usually going to find from plant sources. They're usually liquid at room temperature. These are things like olive oils, or even sometimes like the oily stuff that we'll see in like fish. So here's like a saturated fatty acid. You can see all of the hydrogen binding sites are filled. Oh my God. And then you get, thank you. Then you get your unsaturated fat, which has got a little space for hydrogen there. So because of that space, it's drawn straight here, but it forms these little kinks, and that means that they can't really solidify. So they stay liquid at room temperature. Then you get your proteins, which are usually going to be found most commonly in animal sources, which are just, it's an animal that has assembled all these amino acids together to make up its body. And so like we are protein based, for instance. So, animal sources are going to be very, very high in proteins, but some vegetables are still going to have them as well. But when we look at proteins, we are looking at amino acid complexes, right? So here's like a picture, right? Like legumes, which is like beans and things like that. You're going to see they've got plenty of isoleucine and lysine, but they don't have any tryptophan or methionine, right? So they're missing these two. And grains like whole brown rice, that's going to have plenty of methionine and tryptophan, but they're missing the isoleucine and lysine. So if you were to consume these two things together, that's going to create a complex of all the amino acids. So animal sources are going to do this every time. They're always going to have all your essential amino acids, but plant sources are going to be missing one or more. So you got to make sure that you definitely have a balanced diet in order to ensure that you've got plenty of those in there. Now, that's all of our macros and micros in a nutshell. Now we got to kind of switch to like nutritional guidelines. We start talking about like, well, let's say I'm not getting a bunch of whole foods in my diet. Can I take like a vitamin and mineral supplement to sort of make up for that? And you can, but they're pretty controversial. We haven't seen a lot of actual benefits from taking like multivitamins. I don't think we've also seen very many drawbacks, except for on your wallet. So I'm not thoroughly against taking vitamin and mineral supplements, but like, do I think it's, you'll never hear me say that it's like necessary, unless, you know, you got a client who really just cannot get their whole foods in which case, okay, maybe they could use like a supplement to kind of make up for that. But that's what they're used for. They're used to fill in the gaps of our diet. So when we're talking about like how to healthily eat, one of the types of recommendations we are allowed to give when we're coaching people nutritionally, we cannot tell someone what to eat, but we can give them examples of what healthy meals look like. And one of the best ways to do that is to use what is called the My Plate. And the My Plate is basically designed to like replace the food pyramid. And it's where half of your plate is made up of fruits and vegetables. 1/4 of your plate is made up of like whole grains. So like grains that have lots of fiber in them. And another 1/4 of your plate is made up of some type of lean protein. And then they always recommend, this is the US, so we're going to recommend like 8 ounces of dairy. This is, in my opinion, not super necessary. But that's actually where you'll see me. I prefer to use the Harvard eating plate, which is much better in my opinion, but it follows the same guidelines. Puts a little more emphasis on vegetables, put a little less emphasis on fruits. So there's a less added sugars in your diet. Whole grains are the same, healthy proteins are the same, but then a glass of water at every meal, and then try to get some type of healthy oil, like olive oil or something like that at every meal. Olive oil is incredibly healthy for you because it's got a lot of those good cholesterols that we mentioned. Alcohol, which we don't spend any time ever talking about, is not considered a nutrient because it is not essential to our diet. But it is something that our body can break down. It's just very difficult for our body to break down. So it kind of screws up your metabolism. But alcohol is going to have 7 calories per gram, by the way. Wow, which is still less calories per gram than fat, but that does not mean that it's healthier. And so you can consume it, but definitely always in moderation. So last little bit that we're going to see here for today is we're going to see some general statistics on nutritional disorders, obesity, diabetes, and things like that. So we know that the causes of obesity are very complex, but we also know that like it's all increasing, and we see definitely like a correlation between like an increased sedentary lifestyle, which is very common in our world of computers, smartphones, and heck, especially right now in quarantine. And so like that increased sedentary lifestyle has been associated with a decrease in calorie burn, and decrease in calorie burn means you're going to have more of a calorie surplus, and that surplus will lead to, you know, a growing body. And so how do we measure obesity? Well, we're going to use what is called your body mass index, right? That is a calculation of your height in kilogram, and your weight in kilograms divided by your height in meters squared. Ideally, we want to be from a BMI of about 18.5 up to about 24.9. If your BMI is between 25 and 29.9, that is considered overweight. And if it's above 30, that is considered obese. What we see with obesity is that we see an increased risk for certain types of diseases, primarily things like diabetes, metabolic disorders, cardiovascular disorders, osteoporosis, arthritis, things like that. Now, we also don't want to be underweight, right? If your BMI is less than 18.5, that also has some serious health risks, right? That leads to low energy. It can mess with your sex hormones, which can cause reproduction problems. And it can obviously lead to nutritional deficiencies, which just overall mess with your metabolism. So here's how we're going to measure our BMI, right? Again, it is your weight in kilograms divided by your height in meters squared. So you can, by the way, do this. You can do this in the US version. You just want to take your weight in kilograms divided by, your weight in pounds and divided by 2.2. And if you want to convert your height in inches into meters, you divide it by 39.4. So if you weighed 134 pounds and you're 164 inches tall, you would divide that to get 61 kilograms, and that would give you 1.6 meters. So because you got to square that, the formula is going to be 61, that's your weight in kilograms, divided by 1.6 times 1.6. That's 1.6 squared, which comes out to 2.6, ironically. which is going to be a BMI of about 23.5. That is within healthy ranges, right? 18.5, 24.9, that's the target. Now, is it the best way to educate, to measure somebody's health? Not necessarily. Like, I'm not a huge fan of using the BMI to measure health, but I do like to use it for looking at increased risk of health factors. That I really like. It does not make you healthy to be in a normal BMI range, but it does decrease your risk. And so, like, if you are in a low risk category in a bunch of other types of assessments, now we're starting to have enough data to draw the conclusion that you're in a good spot. And if you fall outside of normal ranges in one of those risks, but you're at low risk in all the others, you're probably still in a pretty good spot. So when we are metabolically breaking stuff down, we do have changes in our body temperature that are going to occur. Heat is a byproduct of chemical reactions. This is why you get hotter. All that whenever you break that ATP molecule, most of the energy is captured by your cells, but some of it, not all of it's getting captured by your cells, some of it is leaking. And so that heat energy leaks out. And that's why our temperature climbs whenever we start exercising. And so, like, that's one of the best ways to kind of heat yourself up, right? Do some work, it'll produce some ATP. You know, do some jumping jacks, get up and moving. We do have a lot of regulatory processes that kind of help us. For instance, like, if you want to produce more heat, you can do some exercise. Your body can produce some hormones, which will kick off your metabolism, and that'll help. Actually, intaking food has been shown to increase your temperature, as long as you're not drinking like cold fluids with it. But then also, like, as we get older, we actually lose body temperature a little bit. So, but that's probably honestly more because of these other things right here, lack of exercise and a reduction in hormones. So when it comes to heat loss, most of your heat loss is lost through your skin, through either conduction, radiation, convection, or evaporation. So that's actually what this is going to look like, right? Radiation is literally just heat kind of passively leaving your body. Convection is actually where when you see like wind or things like that, that causes like, it carries heat away from your body. We've got evaporation, which is literally just water passively working its way upwards because of heat. And then we got conduction, which is like two things that are like transferring heat between them. So these are the different ways that we can kind of heat ourselves up. I always love this fact, but conduction's my favorite one to mention. This is how blankets work. You think what's kind of funny about blankets, like where, you know, putting a blanket on the bed, you are not using that blanket to warm your body up. You are using your body to warm the blanket up. And then that reflects back to you until eventually it bounces back and forth. You're trapping the heat. Weird way to kind of look at it, but that's actually how that works. Do you have a question? I thought I heard the mic for a second. Nope.
Oh, I just said, whoa.
Oh, yeah, it's kind of a fun one, right? That, by the way, is the best way to explain like climate change to someone. It's not so much that like sometimes people will like describe it as like greenhouse. They're like, the greenhouse effect, that's not how greenhouses work. And they're right. Greenhouses don't trap heat. They heat everything in the greenhouse up, and then that reflects the heat back and forth. So greenhouse is actually kind of a poor way to describe climate change. It's more like throwing an extra blanket on the bed every now and then. That's sort of a better way to describe it. Luckily, your body has a lot of internal mechanisms to kind of help you regulate your temperature so that your body doesn't overheat. And so, for instance, if you are trying to like prevent heat loss, your brain will send a signal to your skin to constrict your blood vessels and move those blood vessels away from the surface of your skin. And that will maintain your heat closer to your center, and you won't be losing it to the atmosphere as often. Also, the atmosphere won't be penetrating and adding that cold air back to you. Or maybe it will cause you to shiver, or maybe it'll increase your metabolism. And this is why, and I'm not saying these are good, I'm not saying these are bad, but I will say they are telling the truth at least a little bit. When you look at those cryotherapy things, and they look at like calories burned, you know, sometimes you'll see like advertisement for these things, and it's where you get in this really freaking cold tube and it freezes the heck out of you. it'll burn somewhere around 500 calories and boost your metabolism. Theoretically, that is true. I don't know about 500, but it would increase your calorie burn, because your body's going to go, holy crap, we got to heat back up. So it turns all your cells on. It's like, oh, good God, and sort of tries to heat you back to neutral. And then you've got overheating. Your body's going to try to protect you from this by stimulating sweat glands, which will help with that evaporation process, which will cool you down. It'll actually dilate your blood vessels so that your skin moves close, or your blood moves closer to the surface. And then that way, when that heat leaves you, it's hopefully taking some of it with it. And so that's kind of what we're seeing there. Your age is going to affect your body temperature. Kids suck at thermoregulation. Seniors suck at thermoregulation. Both of those populations, we lose our ability to be good at maintaining temperature as we are very young and as we are very old. So with both populations, you want to make sure that you have plenty of fluids to train with, and you want to make sure that you have plenty of layers to strip down to if you need to. So kids should show up in a jacket and with plenty of water. And that way, if they get overheated, they can take the jacket off. And if they get even more overheated, they can drink the liquids. Then all of a sudden, if they get cold, they can put the jacket back on. So very important for both seniors and kids. And that's something we're going to be talking about in the end of this module. Normal temperatures are, by the way, this is very important. We want to make sure that we maintain a normal temperature. When your temperature is outside of normal ranges, our body doesn't function properly. Your cells really do kind of function at a very narrow range of temperatures. About 97.8, that's where we want to be when it comes to normal temperatures. When we start getting above like 100.8, the things in our body stop working. Your enzymes start to die. Proteins can no longer function. This is why fevers are so dangerous. So we want to be somewhere between here and here. Fever, obviously higher than normal body temperature. Infections, or it can be caused by viruses, whatever. Any of these things can cause fever, and obviously that can sometimes lead to heat cramps, exhaustion, and heat stroke in really extreme cases, which are obviously all fatal. Also, in the other direction, we've got excessive cold. This can be things like hypothermia and frostbite, right? As your body temperature gets too low, your body's tissues can't function either. So those are also extremely dangerous. And that's really all we got. This is kind of a weird one, but it is our talk on metabolism and some of the stuff that we haven't covered in the past. So this is meant to kind of fill in some of the gaps for the in a less detailed ATP production way. But yeah, that's about it. Do you guys have any? Do you guys got questions about anything? Robert, you feeling good? Raul?
I was curious. Do you take any vitamins for anything?
Me? I'll take a probiotic just in case, like I don't have enough like fiber in my diet. I'll take like fish oil every now and then. I've got plenty of fish in my diet, but like it's something that just can't hurt you. And both of those supplements are just incredibly cheap. I'm such a like frugal person. I just don't like spending money on things that are not proven to work. The supplements that I do take, I definitely take whey protein. It's a super great source of protein, and it's a super great source of calories, which is something that I tend to struggle with because I don't have a very big appetite. Yeah. So getting enough calories in is something that I continually struggle with my whole life. And so, yeah, right, yeah. You're like, I hear you, man. You're like a baby bird. And so, like, gaining muscle and things like that can be difficult if I'm not, like, getting enough, calories. And so, I'll eat, like, a really healthy meal and be like, all right, that was great. That has high in vitamins and minerals and high in fiber. How many calories? 350, oh. So it's like protein shake, boom, Yeah. And that is definitely under the realm of supplements. I will also occasionally use like a cup of coffee before I work out on purpose. So I'm supplementing technically with caffeine, even though it's just like a cup of coffee.
Yeah.
And every now and then I'll take creatine if I'm doing like max strength lifting, although fairly rarely. I don't use it that often because it's not really my favorite type of lifting. But creatine can be a really effective supplement for driving more water into your cells, which results in like a bigger immune response. So it's easier to grow muscles and easier to grow your strength when you're on things like creatine. So that's another one. Those are the supplements that I kind of believe in. Vitamins, not against them, but not.
Drink coffee before a workout. You don't feel dehydrated sometimes, or?
Me, no. But then again, I don't know. I'm kind of insensitive to stuff like that. I'm probably dehydrated more often than I'm really aware of.
Yeah.
I mean, most people kind of are. But no, I don't really get any of that. I also don't get. Coffee is like it's a diuretic, so it often triggers like you to have to like go to the bathroom pretty quickly, and I don't get that from coffee either. So I don't know. Might just not be like sensitive to it.
Yeah.
My parents let me drink a lot of caffeine when I was a child. So I wonder if that has a lot to do with it. I wonder if I've just like lost caffeine sensitivity. Which is not awesome. I was raised on the road. My parents are truck drivers, so I lived in a truck till I was 5, and we would go to like truck stops. And so my parents, I would get truck stop size, like trucker, like adult male truck driver portions as like a child. And so I'd be like, can I get a Coke? And they would give, and it would be like that tall and like in this plastic. And, my parents were like, yeah, we don't know. So maybe that desensitized me.
Maybe a little bit.
But yeah, that's about it, guys. Tomorrow, or look for homework 4 is up today. It's our final piece of homework. So you can knock that out and then get to study in 3 and 4 for the final. Tomorrow we will do the NASM approach to metabolism. So tomorrow we'll look at like how intensities target different types of metabolism. So we're going to look at glycolysis and the Krebs cycle again. And we'll look at them from the perspective of like, you lift heavy, that means your duration is going to be short. That means you're in glycolysis. You lift light, that means your duration is going to be long. That's going to put you in your aerobic metabolism.
Okay.
So that'll be the more hands-on side. And yeah, I'll see you guys tomorrow.
All right. Have a good day, man.
Have a good one. See ya.